Tonight, let us leave behind the noise of our modern world. No glowing screens, no engines, no city lights. Instead, let us walk quietly into the mists of the past. More than 1,000 years ago, in the far north of Europe, a people lived on the edge of the known world. Their winters were long, their summers short, their land harsh and unyielding. Yet from this land would rise men and women whose names and stories still echo across history. They are remembered by one word: Vikings. When you hear this word, perhaps you see fierce warriors with wild beards and horned helmets storming across the sea. Perhaps you imagine villages set aflame, frightened monks praying as longships appear on the horizon. Perhaps you picture the clash of axes, the thunder of shields. And yes, those images carry truth. But the Vikings were also so much more. They were farmers who worked stubborn soil. They were shipbuilders whose craftsmanship outpaced all their rivals. They were explorers who touched the far edges of the known world and beyond. They were poets, storytellers, traders, craftsmen, and dreamers. Tonight, we will walk slowly through their age, not in the rush of battle, but in the calm rhythm of the sea. From their humble beginnings in the fjords of Scandinavia to the great kings who reshaped their world. This is the Viking Age. Breathe slowly and let your mind drift to the northern winds. Close your eyes and hear the creak of a wooden ship on dark waters. Smell the smoke of a hearth fire. Taste the salt of the sea air. We are stepping gently into their world. Chapter 1: The Origins of the Vikings. Long before the name Viking spread fear across Europe, the people of Scandinavia lived quietly in their rugged homelands. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark formed their world, though they did not call them by those names. These were lands of forests, fjords, rocky coasts, and endless water. The climate was unforgiving. Winters dragged on with snow and bitter winds. For months, the sun was weak or gone entirely, and people survived in dim light by the heat of a fire. Summers arrived suddenly, brief but full of life. The fields turned green, the days grew long, and people hurried to plant, to fish, to trade, to store enough food for the next winter's test. Life was never easy. To survive here required strength, resilience, and endless resourcefulness. The hearth and the home. Picture a small settlement beside a Norwegian fjord. Wooden houses stand close together, their roofs covered with turf to keep out the cold. Smoke curls upward into the gray sky. Inside one of these houses, a family gathers. The longhouse is dim, lit only by the central fire. Its warmth is precious, for outside frost clings even to the stones. Around the fire, people eat, work, tell stories. At night, they lie close together on benches and beds covered with furs, listening to the crackle of flames and the howl of the wind outside. Animals share the space too. Cows, goats, and sheep huddle inside, their body heat adding to the warmth. The smell is strong, but it is survival. Without them, the long winter might be too much. Here, children learn the skills of life from an early age. Boys follow their fathers into the forest to hunt or down to the sea to fish. Girls learn the weaving of cloth, the milking of animals, the tending of the home. But these roles were not rigid. Viking women were stronger and more independent than in many other places of the time. The role of women. Unlike in much of medieval Europe, Viking women could inherit property. They could demand divorce. They could speak in assemblies, manage farms, and lead households. When men went to sea, women often controlled everything at home. They were respected, not only as mothers and wives, but as individuals who carried the honor of their families. In sagas and stories, women appear not only as background figures, but as advisors, poets, even warriors in rare cases. They were keepers of memory, singers of songs, and sometimes the sharpest voices in disputes. This balance between men and women gave Viking society a unique strength. It allowed them to thrive in conditions that might have crushed weaker cultures. Honor, reputation, and the law. In the Viking world, honor was life itself. A man could lose land, he could lose wealth, but if he lost his honor, he was nothing. Insults, feuds, and rivalries were taken seriously. If someone wronged you, it was expected that you would defend your reputation. Feuds could last years, even monasteries filled with silver and gold, guarded only by praying monks. Markets to the south, where silk, spices, and wine could be traded for furs and iron. To the east, rivers that flowed deep into lands rich with opportunity. Some set out from necessity, others from greed, others from adventure, the simple thrill of facing the unknown. But all shared one thing: the sea was their road, and their ships were their wings. The meaning of Viking. The word itself carries mystery. To go Viking was not to belong to a nation, but to take part in an activity. It meant to set sail on an expedition, whether for raiding, trading, or exploring. Not every Scandinavian was a Viking. Many never left their homes, living and dying on the same farm where their ancestors had lived. But those who chose the sea, those who sought fortune, adventure, or survival, they were the ones remembered. The world beyond Scandinavia. As the Vikings prepared to leave, the wider world was in flux. In England, small kingdoms fought each other. In France, the empire of Charlemagne had risen, but after his death, cracks were beginning to show. In the east, Slavic tribes and the glittering empire of Byzantium offered both danger and opportunity. The Vikings stood at the crossroads of all these worlds. They were perfectly placed to take advantage of weakness, to trade where trade was open, to raid where resistance was weak. And so, in the year 793, the first thunderclap of the Viking Age struck, the raid on Lindisfarne, an island monastery off the coast of England. But that is a story for later. For now, we remain with the people of the north, standing on their rocky shores, their ships ready, their eyes fixed on horizons unknown. We have stepped into the world of the Vikings before their great age began. We have seen their long houses, felt the warmth of their hearths, watched their children grow among fjords and forests. We have understood the honor that guided them, the women who shaped them, the hunger that pushed them. And above all, we have heard the call of the sea. In our next chapter, we will climb aboard their greatest invention, the longship. We will hear the creak of oars, the snap of sails, the rush of water beneath the hull. And we will see how these ships carried the Vikings not only across Europe, but across the very boundaries of the known world. For now, rest gently. The story continues. The Viking longships and seafaring genius. The sea was the heart of the Viking world. For those who lived among the fjords and rocky coasts of Scandinavia, the ocean was not a barrier, but a path. Where others saw endless water, the Vikings saw roads made of waves, stretching toward distant lands and unknown horizons. Imagine a dawn in Norway, mist rising over the dark sea, the smell of salt in the air, gulls circling above, their cries echoing across the stillness. Along the shore, a wooden skeleton of a ship rests upon logs, craftsmen hammering, axes cutting, tar bubbling in a pot. Slowly, plank by plank, something extraordinary takes shape, a vessel unlike any the world had seen before. This was the Viking longship, a marvel of its time, an invention so advanced that even centuries later, scholars still marvel at its brilliance. The birth of the longship. The longship was not merely a boat, it was a symbol of freedom, of mobility, of the Viking spirit itself. These ships were slender, flexible, and designed with shallow drafts, which meant they could sail not only across the open seas but also glide up narrow rivers with ease. Imagine the fear of monks in England, hearing the sudden sound of oars slapping against water, only to see dragon-headed ships emerging from the mist on rivers no one thought navigable. The construction was an art form. Oak was the wood of choice, strong yet pliable. Each plank was overlapped in what is called the clinker style, secured with iron rivets. This overlapping design made the hull flexible, able to twist and bend with the waves rather than break. Unlike the rigid ships of the Mediterranean, Viking longships seemed alive, moving with the sea instead of against it. The keel, running down the middle, gave stability. The prow and stern rose high, often carved into the heads of dragons, serpents, or beasts. Symbols meant both to protect the crew and to terrify enemies. At times, these carved heads were removable. Vikings would take them off when approaching friendly shores so as not to scare local spirits, masters of speed and silence. What made these ships terrifying was not only their appearance but their speed. With both sails and oars, a longship could move faster than almost any vessel of its age. The square woolen sail, dyed red or striped with bold colors, caught the wind and propelled the ship forward. When the wind died, dozens of oars would dip into the water in perfect rhythm, the rowers pulling silently, their breath controlled, their movements like one living creature. Imagine being on a quiet English coast in the 9th century, the morning sun rising over calm waters, and suddenly hearing nothing but the faint splash of oars. By the time you realized what was coming, the ships would already be at the shore. There was no time to prepare, no chance to escape. Some longships carried 40 men, others more than 60. The largest, known as the Great Ship, could hold hundreds. Yet no matter their size, they could sail both the stormy North Sea and shallow rivers alike. This gave the Vikings an advantage unmatched by their enemies: unpredictability. They could strike anywhere at any time. Navigation, the secrets of the sea. One of the great mysteries of Viking success was their ability to navigate vast distances long before compasses were widely used in Europe. How did they cross the North Atlantic, reaching Greenland and even North America? The answer lies in a mix of skill, observation, and legend. The Vikings used the sun as their guide. By day, they could judge direction by the sun's path. By night, they looked to the stars, particularly the North Star, steady in the sky. Yet, when the skies were cloudy, they turned to something even more remarkable: the sunstone. According to sagas, sunstones were crystals that could detect the polarization of light, even on overcast days. By holding the stone to the sky, they could find where the sun was hidden. Vikings approaching. To hear "the heathens are coming by sea" was enough to cause villagers to flee. The cultural power of the ship. But the longship was not only a tool of war, it was central to Viking culture and identity. In Norse poetry and sagas, ships are symbols of power, freedom, and the journey of life itself. Even in death, great leaders were honored with ships. The famous ship burials, such as the Oseberg ship found in Norway, reveal the importance of these vessels, buried within mounds, alongside goods, weapons, proving the brilliance of their design. Standing before one of these ships today, preserved in museums in Oslo or Roskilde, one cannot help but feel awe. The wood, though aged, still whispers of the sea, of storms weathered, of distant lands reached. It is not just a relic. It is a reminder of human courage and ingenuity. As the sun sets in our story, imagine a fleet of longships on the horizon, sails glowing red in the fading light, the sound of waves, the cry of gulls, the steady beat of oars. These were not mere raiders. They were masters of the sea, explorers of the unknown, deemed impossible. Chroniclers at the time wrote of it as a punishment from God, a sign of wrath against sinful men. They described the raiders as demons, beasts, and heathens, their cruelty beyond imagining. But to the Vikings, it was something else entirely, an opportunity. For them, monasteries were perfect targets. They were rich, filled with gold and silver, and poorly defended. The monks had little more than prayers to shield them. And so, what began at Lindisfarne would repeat again and again across the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. The raids spread. In the years that followed, Viking ships appeared like ghosts along the shores of Europe. They struck the monastery at Jarrow, raided the coasts of Ireland, and soon moved farther south into Frankish lands. The pattern was always the same. Villages and towns built near rivers or the sea were suddenly assaulted. Churches burned, nobles ransomed, common folk enslaved. The raiders carried away not only treasure, but also people, selling them in the slave markets of Scandinavia or even farther east. The terror spread so widely that in many churches a new prayer was added. "Deliver us, O Lord, from the fury of the Northmen." Why raiding began. Historians have long asked, why did the Viking raids begin when they did? Part of the answer lies in Scandinavia itself. The land was beautiful but harsh. The soil was thin, the winters long. Population was growing and resources were limited. For ambitious young men, land was scarce, opportunities few. But the sea offered more. To raid was not only to gain wealth, it was to gain honor. A young man who returned home with silver and slaves earned respect, songs, and the favor of women. Raiding was dangerous, but it was also a path to status, to reputation, to a place in Valhalla. Another reason was political. Local chieftains encouraged raids to gather wealth and strengthen their power. By leading men to victory, a leader proved his worth. In the fragmented world of early Scandinavia, power was personal, tied to bravery and generosity. A chieftain who returned with treasure could distribute it among his followers, binding them to him with loyalty. And generations lived in fear of the Northmen. To them, the sea itself became a source of terror, for from it could come sudden death at any time. Raids become invasions. At first, Viking raids were small, fleets of 2 or 3 ships, crews of a few dozen men. But as success grew, so did ambition. By the mid-9th century, fleets of dozens, even hundreds of ships, set out across the seas. In Ireland, the Vikings established permanent bases, building fortresses called long forts. From these strongholds, they could raid deeper inland and control trade routes. The city of Dublin itself began as a Viking settlement, founded in 841, growing from a raiding camp into one of the most important towns in Ireland. In England, the attacks grew so frequent that entire kingdoms trembled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records year after year of raids, monasteries burning, kings paying tribute. By the 860s, the raids had become something greater, the arrival of what was called the Great Heathen Army, a force not of raiders but of conquerors, the fear of the cross. One of the most shocking aspects of the raids to Christians was the Vikings' disregard for holy places. To them, a church was not sacred, it was a storehouse of treasure. Gold chalices, jeweled crosses, silver reliquaries, all were plunder to be taken. To the monks, it seemed unimaginable. How could men have so little fear of God? But the Vikings followed different gods, and their worldview was shaped by Odin, Thor, and Loki, not by Christ. They feared dishonor more than sin, and sought glory in battle rather than salvation in prayer. This clash of beliefs made the raids feel not just like violence, but like the invasion of demons. To the Christian chroniclers, the Northmen were agents of chaos, sent by the devil himself. The fame of the raiders. Back in Scandinavia, tales of raids spread quickly. Songs were sung of the silver taken from English churches, the wine drunk from Frankish cellars, the slaves brought home from Irish villages. Young men longed to join. Fathers urged their sons to prove themselves. Even those who did not raid benefited from the treasures that poured into the north. Silver from the east, gold from the west, new goods, new ideas, all flowed back on Viking ships. And so, raiding became not just a way of life, but the very heartbeat of Viking society. The turning point. As the 9th century wore on, the raids shifted. They were no longer merely lightning strikes for treasure. The Vikings began to settle. They claimed land, built towns, and married locals. In Ireland, in England, in Normandy, they left behind not just scars, but roots. The age of raids was giving way to something larger, the age of Viking kingdoms abroad. But the fear, the memory of sudden attacks in the night would never fade. Picture again the coast of England, waves rolling onto the sand. The monks of Lindisfarne had no warning, no defense, no chance. Yet in their tragedy, the world awoke to the power of the Vikings. From that first raid onward, Europe would never sleep peacefully again. The Northmen had arrived, and they would shape the destiny of nations. As night falls on this chapter, we leave behind the burning monasteries and frightened villages, and turn toward a different side of Viking life, their homes, their families, their daily world. For to understand the raiders, we must also understand the farmers, the craftsmen, and the storytellers who gave them life. Viking settlements, daily life, and Norse mythology. When we think of Vikings, we often imagine warriors with axes and shields, charging into monasteries or sailing fierce ships across stormy seas. Yet, for most of their lives, the Vikings were not raiders at all. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, mothers, fathers, children. Their raids, though famous, were only part of a much larger story. To truly understand them, we must step away from the battlefield and into their homes, settling the land. Scandinavia, the home of the Vikings, was rugged and beautiful. Fjords carved deep into the coasts, forests stretched endlessly, mountains rose high against the sky. But life here was not easy. Winters were long and harsh. Summers, though bright, were short. Villages were small clusters of wooden houses, built near the sea or along fertile valleys. The houses were long and narrow, known as longhouses, built of timber and turf with thatched or wooden roofs. They sheltered both people and animals under one roof. In the long, cold winters, warmth was precious, and so cows, sheep, and goats shared the home with the family, their body heat adding to the fire at the hearth. Inside, smoke from the central fire curled upward through a hole in the roof. The walls were lined with benches where people slept wrapped in furs. In the dim light, the smell of wood smoke, animal hides, and stew blended into the air. Life was simple, but it was life sustained by hard work, farming, and food. Most Vikings were farmers. Raiding might bring sudden wealth, but farming brought survival. Barley, rye, and oats were planted in the spring, harvested in the autumn. Cabbage, beans, and root vegetables filled their fields. Cows gave milk, which was turned into cheese and butter. Sheep provided wool, pigs gave meat. Fishing was essential. The seas around Scandinavia teemed with herring, cod, and salmon. Nets were cast, hooks baited, and fish dried or smoked for winter. Hunting added venison, boar, and wild birds to the diet. Meals were simple but hearty. Bread from barley flour, porridge thickened with milk, stews of meat and vegetables, fish roasted over flames. In summer, berries and apples were gathered. Honey-sweetened drinks and mead, fermented honey, was enjoyed at feasts. Ale was common, even for children, as it was safer than water. Stronger drinks like imported wine were rare, luxuries for the wealthy. Family and society. The family was the core of Viking society. Men farmed, fished, built, and fought. Women managed the home, raised children, tended animals, and even ran farms when their husbands were away on raids. Unlike in many other cultures of the time, Viking women had notable rights. They could own land, inherit property, and even divorce husbands. A wife's keys, often worn on her belt, symbolized her authority. Roasted meat, bread, cheese, and barrels of ale. Songs were sung, stories told. Skalds, the poets, recited sagas of heroes and gods. The hall rang with laughter, with the clinking of cups, with the stamping of feet to music played on harps and flutes. At the heart of these feasts was not just food, but community. They bound people together, reminded them of their shared past, and inspired them for the future, the world of the gods. To the Vikings, daily life was never separate from the world of the gods. Their mythology was woven into every action, every ritual, every dream. They believed in a great cosmos, held together by the world tree Yggdrasil. Its branches reached into the heavens, its roots into the underworld, binding 9 realms together. At the highest realm lived the gods of Asgard, led by Odin, the All-Father. One-eyed, wise, and relentless in his search for knowledge, Odin sacrificed much to gain wisdom. He hung for 9 nights upon Yggdrasil, wounded by his own spear, to discover the runes. He traded an eye for a drink from the well of wisdom. Thor, god of thunder, was perhaps the most beloved. With his hammer, Mjolnir, he defended gods and men alike against the giants who threatened the world. Farmers prayed to him for fertility of crops and protection from storms. Freya, goddess of love and beauty, rode a chariot drawn by cats. She ruled over magic and received half the slain in battle, the other half going to Odin's hall of Valhalla. Loki, the trickster, brought both mischief and catastrophe. His schemes often led to disaster, yet without him, the sagas would lack their twists and turns. Valhalla and the afterlife. For warriors, the dream was to die in battle and be chosen by the Valkyries to enter Valhalla, Odin's great hall. There they would feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of the world, when they would march alongside the gods in the final battle. But Valhalla was not the only afterlife. Many souls went to Hel, a cold, shadowy realm ruled by the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. Others went to Freya's hall, Folkvanger. The afterlife was varied, complex, reflecting the richness of their beliefs, rituals, and runes. The Vikings honored their gods with offerings of food, animals, or, at times, human sacrifices. Sacred groves, stones, and springs were places of worship. Blots, sacrificial feasts, were held to seek favor in war, harvest, or voyages. Runes, carved into wood or stone, held power beyond letters. They were signs of magic, used for charms, blessings, and curses. To carve a rune was not just to write, it was to shape destiny. Storytelling by firelight. Picture a winter night in a Viking longhouse. Outside, snow covers the ground. Wind howls through the trees. Inside, the fire burns, casting flickering shadows on timbered walls. Families gather close, children drowsy beneath furs, while a skald begins to speak. His voice tells of Odin's wisdom, Thor's battles, Loki's tricks, and the coming doom of Ragnarok. The stories are not only entertainment, they are the memory of the people, the lessons of life, the hope of the future. Through these sagas, the Vikings kept their world alive, passing it from generation to generation. Daily life in the Viking Age was a balance of toil and joy, of hardship and celebration, of reality and myth. They were farmers and warriors, builders and destroyers, traders and poets. Their homes were simple, yet their imagination vast, reaching into worlds of gods and giants. As we leave their hearths and stories behind, we carry with us an understanding. The Vikings were not only raiders of Europe, but creators of a vibrant culture. And as our journey continues, we turn now to the great figures. Among them, the legendary leaders whose names still echo through history. Famous Viking leaders and Viking expansion. The Viking Age was not just shaped by nameless raiders or faceless farmers. It was also defined by leaders, men and sometimes women, whose courage, ambition, and vision carried their people far beyond the fjords of Scandinavia. Through their journeys, battles, and legacies, the Vikings left footprints across Europe and even into the East. Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway. Our journey begins in Norway, with Harald Fairhair remembered as the first king to unite the land. In the 9th century, Norway was divided into many small chiefdoms, each led by its own ruler. Harald, still a young man, fell in love with a woman named Gyda, but Gyda refused to marry him unless he ruled all of Norway. Ambitious and determined, Harald swore an oath that he would not cut his hair until he achieved this feat. For years, his hair grew long and wild as he fought rival chieftains. One by one, he defeated them, through battle or alliance, until at last he stood as king over a united Norway. Only then did he cut and comb his hair, earning the name Harald Fairhair. His story is not just a tale of romance, but of ambition that shaped an entire kingdom. By uniting Norway, Harald created a base from which Vikings would sail farther than ever before. Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary raider. Perhaps no name from the Viking Age is more famous than Ragnar Lothbrok, yet his life is shrouded in both history and legend. Ragnar is said to have been a fearless warrior, a man who wore trousers made from animal hides boiled in tar, hence the name Lothbrok, or shaggy, breeches. He raided across France and England, striking fear wherever his ships landed. One of his most daring exploits was the attack on Paris in 845. With dozens of ships, Ragnar sailed up the River Seine, breaking through defenses until the city trembled before him. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, was forced to pay a massive ransom to make the Vikings leave. Ragnar returned home wealthy and renowned, but legend also tells of his downfall. Captured by the Northumbrian king Aella, Ragnar was thrown into a pit of snakes where he met his death. As the serpents bit into him, he is said to have laughed, declaring that his sons would avenge him. And avenge him they did, the sons of Ragnar, the great heathen army. Ragnar's sons, Björn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba Hvitserk, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, became legends in their own right. Together, they did not last. The memory lived on, a testament to the Viking spirit of exploration. Knut the Great, the Viking king of England. Another powerful leader was Knut the Great. By the early 11th century, Viking raids on England had grown into something more: conquest. Knut, son of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, invaded England and seized the throne. He ruled not only England, but also Denmark and Norway, creating a North Sea empire that made him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Unlike the raiders before him, Knut sought stability. He respected English customs, worked with the church, and brought peace to lands long torn by war. Under his rule, England prospered, Stories of Nut reveal both wisdom and humility. One famous tale tells how he ordered his throne placed on the seashore and commanded the tide not to rise. When the waves ignored him, soaking his feet, Nut turned to his men and reminded them that only God commanded the seas. Whether fact or legend, the tale shows how even a Viking king could bow before greater powers. Viking expansion from east to west. The leaders we've met were part of a larger story, the expansion of the Viking world. To the west, Vikings raided the British Isles, Ireland, and the coasts of France. Dublin, once a small settlement, was transformed into a thriving Viking town. York in England became Jorvik, a major center of trade and culture. To the south, they sailed into the Mediterranean, reaching Spain, Italy, and even North Africa. Their longships carried them into lands far from their cold northern homes. But perhaps their most surprising journeys were to the east. Along the great rivers of Russia, Vikings known as Varangians traveled as traders and mercenaries. They founded settlements that would grow into cities like Novgorod and Kiev. Some even served as elite guards for the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, becoming part of the famous Varangian Guard. The reach of the Vikings stretched from Newfoundland in the west to the gates of Constantinople in the east. Few peoples of their age matched such daring, the spirit of leadership. What made these leaders remarkable was not only their conquests or discoveries, but the spirit they embodied. Harold Fairhair's ambition, Ragnar's daring, Ivar's cunning, Leif's curiosity, Nut's wisdom, together they reveal the many faces of Viking leadership. Through them, we see how a people once thought of as raiders alone built kingdoms, explored oceans, and left stories that echo to this day. The Viking Age was not simply an age of battles, but of leaders whose visions carried their people across seas and into history. Some ruled with iron fists, others with clever minds, still others with dreams of lands unseen. As we leave behind the stories of these leaders, our journey turns toward the twilight of the Viking Age, the changes that came, the decline of their power, and the end of an era that reshaped the world. The rise of Christianity and cultural shift, the dawn of change. The Viking Age had begun with the thunder of oars and the cry of warriors, but as centuries passed, a quieter sound began to echo across Scandinavia, the tolling of church bells. This was the dawn of a new age, not forged by axes or swords, but by crosses and prayers. By the 10th century, whispers of change carried through the fjords and valleys. Where once people sacrificed animals to Odin and Thor, some now crossed themselves in the name of Christ. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was slow, uneven, and often filled with struggle. Yet, it was perhaps the most powerful shift in the history of the North. The old beliefs hold strong. Before Christianity, Norse religion shaped every aspect of life. At the heart of their faith was a world of gods and giants, of fate and prophecy. Odin was the seeker of wisdom, Thor the protector with his mighty hammer, Freya the goddess of love and fertility, and Loki the cunning trickster who brought chaos. To the Vikings, these gods were not distant figures. They lived in every storm, every harvest, every battle. A clap of thunder was Thor's hammer striking the sky. A raven's flight was a sign from Odin. Life was a constant dialogue with the divine. Festivals were held at great halls where mead flowed and fires roared. Sacrifices were offered, sometimes animals, sometimes wealth, and on rare occasions, even humans. The smell of roasted meat rose with prayers to the heavens. Runes were carved into wood and stone, believed to hold magic and fate itself. For the Vikings, this was not just religion, it was identity. To abandon it seemed like abandoning their very ancestors. The arrival of the cross. Christianity had long existed in lands to the south. Missionaries carried its message from Rome, from Germany, from England. At first, it spread slowly, reaching only those who had contact with foreign traders. A Viking merchant who returned from England might wear a small cross around his neck. A captured slave might whisper Christian prayers in the dark. But then, kings began to take notice. Christianity was more than belief. It was power. To be Christian meant to be connected with the great kingdoms of Europe. It meant alliances, trade, and recognition. And so, rulers turned to the cross, sometimes out of faith, sometimes out of politics. Harold Bluetooth, the king who made the Danes Christian, one of the first great champions of Christianity in Scandinavia, was Harold Bluetooth, king of Denmark in the 10th century. His reign was long, filled with both war and diplomacy. Harold's decision to accept Christianity was a turning point. He declared that he had made the Danes Christian, a bold statement carved forever into the gelling stones, great monuments that still stand today. These stones bear runic inscriptions and images that mark the meeting of old and new, where pagan art swirls around, Christian crosses. But conversion was not simple. Some of his people resisted, holding tightly to Thor and Odin. Yet Harold pushed forward, building churches, inviting priests, and weaving the new faith into the fabric of his kingdom. Over time, Christianity took root, though echoes of the old gods remained in folklore and custom. Olaf Tryggvason, the fiery missionary king. In Norway, the work of spreading Christianity fell to Olaf Tryggvason, a king as fierce as he was devout. Olaf was no gentle preacher. Daily life slowly changed. Wooden temples gave way to stone churches. Where once feasts were held in honor of Thor, now festivals celebrated Christ. Yule, the midwinter festival of the pagans, became Christmas. The spring celebrations of fertility became Easter. Old traditions did not vanish. They were transformed, woven into the Christian calendar. Families began to baptize their children. Marriages were blessed by priests rather than shamans. Graves shifted from burial mounds, filled with weapons and treasures, to simple crosses and prayers. And yet, beneath the surface, old habits remained. Farmers still left offerings in the fields. Fishermen still whispered to the sea, and stories of Odin and Thor were still told by firesides. Christianity may have conquered outwardly, but inwardly, the old gods lived on for centuries. Why Christianity triumphed? Why did Christianity succeed where so many other faiths failed? The answer lies in more than just kings and priests. First, Christianity offered unity. The many Norse gods each ruled their own domain. Thor over thunder, Njord over the sea, Freya over love. But Christianity offered one God, one faith, one community that stretched across Europe. This unity gave the Vikings a sense of belonging to a larger world. Second, Christianity offered stability. Where Norse religion focused on fate and courage, Christianity promised forgiveness and eternal life. For people weary of war, famine, and uncertainty, this promise was powerful. Third, Christianity came with power. To be Christian was to be accepted by Europe's great kingdoms. It opened doors to alliances, marriages, and trade. For rulers like Harold Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason, conversion was both faith and strategy, the survival of Norse heritage. And yet, though Christianity triumphed, the Norse world did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. The sagas, those great tales of gods and heroes, were written down by Christian monks who preserved them even as they disapproved of their pagan origins. The myths of Odin, Thor, and Loki survived, carried into the modern world. Old festivals remained, reshaped into Christian holidays. Even today, many traditions of Scandinavia, from Yule logs to midsummer fires, have roots in the old religion. The language, too, carried memories. Words tied to Norse belief, like Thursday, named for Thor, remained in everyday speech. In this way, the Old World and the New World blended, creating a culture that was both Christian and Norse, both old and new, a world transformed. By the end of the Viking Age, Scandinavia was no longer a land of pagan raiders. It was a land of Christian kingdoms, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, ruled by kings who built churches as well as ships. The dragon-headed longships that had once carried terror now carried merchants. The fires of pagan temples had been extinguished, replaced by the quiet glow of candles in churches. The transformation was complete, yet the memory of what had been remained, echoing in stone, in story, and in spirit. The end of endless raids. In the early centuries of the Viking Age, Scandinavians were feared raiders. Their longships appeared suddenly on foreign shores. Their warriors burned villages, looted monasteries, and returned home with silver and slaves. For generations, this was the Viking way of life. But by the late 10th and 11th centuries, a change began. The constant raids that had once brought glory and wealth started to bring resistance. European kingdoms had grown stronger, building fortifications and organizing armies. Raids that had once been easy victories now became costly battles. At the same time, life in Scandinavia itself was changing. The population was growing. Settlements became larger, trade routes more established. People needed stability, not endless warfare. The time had come to shift from raiders to rulers, from plunder to politics, the seeds of kingdoms. The Vikings had always had leaders, jarls, chieftains, and warlords, but true kingship was rare in the early days. A king might rule only a small region, his power constantly challenged by rivals. Loyalty was fragile, shifting with fortune and favor. As Christianity spread, so did the idea of centralized monarchy. Kings began to see themselves not just as war leaders but as rulers by divine right. They built permanent seats of power, created laws, and demanded taxes. Their rule stretched beyond one valley or fjord. It reached across entire lands. This was the birth of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden as kingdoms. Denmark, the first great kingdom. Among the Scandinavian lands, Denmark rose first as a unified kingdom. Its fertile land, central location, and powerful rulers allowed it to dominate early. Under Harald Bluetooth, Denmark not only embraced Christianity, but also established stronger royal authority. His successors built upon this foundation. The greatest Danish ruler of all was Canute the Great. In the early 11th century, Canute created a North Sea empire, ruling over Denmark, Norway, and even England. For a brief time, he was one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. His reign brought wealth and prestige, showing how far the Vikings had come from mere raiders. Although Canute's empire did not survive long after his death, his legacy was clear. Denmark was a kingdom of strength, diplomacy, and influence. Norway, a land of warriors and kings. Norway's path to kingdom was more difficult. Its rugged fjords and scattered settlements made unification hard. Yet, leaders rose who dreamed of bringing all of Norway under one crown. The saga of unification begins with Harald Fairhair, who, according to legend, vowed not to cut his hair until he had united Norway. Through battle and cunning, he became the first true king of Norway in the late 9th century. Centuries later, Rulers like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, used Christianity as a unifying force. Saint Olaf, in particular, became a national hero. Though he died in battle at Stiklestad, he was later declared a saint, and his cult helped solidify both Christianity and kingship in Norway. By the 11th century, Norway had transformed from a land of scattered chiefs to a Christian kingdom with growing central power. Sweden, the last to unite. Sweden's unification came later than Denmark and Norway. Its geography, with vast forests and inland trade routes, made it less vulnerable to raids and slower to centralize. The kingdom's early rulers, like Olaf Skotkonung, embraced Christianity around the year 1000. He was baptized and began minting coins, symbols of a king, who saw himself as part of European Christendom. Yet pagan traditions held on stubbornly in Sweden, especially in Uppsala, where great sacrifices continued for generations. Only after long struggle did Christianity and monarchy fully take hold. By the 12th century, Sweden stood alongside Denmark and Norway as a recognized kingdom, from warriors to statesmen. The transformation of Viking leaders from raiders to kings was dramatic. A warlord might once have judged his success by the silver he plundered and the enemies he slew. Now, a king measured his worth in lands, laws, and loyalty. Kings established assemblies, things, where free men gathered to settle disputes and approve laws. They built churches, which not only served religion, but also royal power. They created taxation systems, drawing wealth not from raids abroad, but from farmers at home. This was the birth of governance, of organized states that could stand among the kingdoms of Europe. A world reborn. By the close of the Viking Age, the transformation was complete. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden stood as Christian kingdoms. Their rulers no longer mere raiders, but recognized monarchs. Their wealth came not from plunder, but from trade and taxation. Their place was not on the fringes of Europe, but within its heart. The Viking Age had begun with chaos and raids, but it ended with order and states. The children of Odin had become the children of Christendom. Yet, in their sagas, their stories, and their spirit, the Vikings lived on. The voice of the North, oral tradition. Before kingdoms rose, before Christianity spread, before monasteries chronicled events in ink and parchment, the Vikings had stories. Stories were their history, their entertainment, their education. Around the fire in longhouses, skalds, poets, and bards recited verses that carried the memory of ancestors, the deeds of heroes, and the myths of gods. These sagas were not just entertainment. They were the soul of the Norse world. Through them, values like courage, honor, and loyalty lived on. They told children what it meant to be brave, reminded warriors of their duty, and gave farmers a sense of belonging to a larger story. Unlike the chronicles of Christian monks, Norse storytelling was not written in the beginning. It was sung, spoken, remembered. Words were carved into memory, carried from one generation to the next, the sagas written down. With the coming of Christianity and writing, many of these oral stories were finally preserved in texts. By the 13th century, in Iceland above all, scribes recorded the great sagas that we still read today. The Íslendingasögur, sagas of Icelanders, told of family feuds, law disputes, and blood vengeance. They described everyday life as vividly as they described heroic deeds. They gave us insight into the real lives of people during the Viking Age, how they loved, how they quarreled, how they sought justice. The king's sagas recounted the deeds of Norwegian rulers, blending history with legend. Meanwhile, the Eddas, both poetic and prose, preserved the ancient myths of Odin, Thor, Loki, and the twilight of the gods. Without these sagas, much of Norse mythology and Viking culture would have vanished. Instead, through them, the voice of the Vikings echoes into our own time. Runes, the written soul of the North. Long before parchment and ink, the Vikings had their own form of writing, runes. The runic alphabet, called the Futhark, was carved into stone, wood, bone, and metal. Runes were not only letters, but also symbols of power. Each rune carried meaning, a connection to the divine. To carve runes was to invoke fate, to set words in the fabric of the world. Rune stones still stand across Scandinavia, silent monuments to the people who once carved them. Some commemorate the dead, inscribing names of warriors or family members. Others boast of voyages, battles, and accomplishments. A few even contain cryptic messages, riddles, or charms. Runes gave the Vikings a way to leave their mark on history. Unlike the sagas, which were recorded later, rune stones come directly from the Viking Age itself. When you look upon them, you read the very words carved by Viking hands 1,000 years ago. Mythology that endures. The gods of the Norse were never fully forgotten. Even after Christianity spread, their presence lingered in memory and tradition. Odin, the All-Father, the seeker of wisdom who sacrificed his eye for knowledge. Thor, the thunderer, defender of mankind, whose hammer still strikes in popular imagination. Loki, the trickster, whose mischief leads to chaos. And Ragnarok, the final battle, where gods and giants fall only for the world to be reborn anew. These myths were not only stories, they were explanations of the world. They taught why storms raged, why seasons changed, why life demanded both struggle and endurance. Today, Norse mythology has spread far beyond Scandinavia. It inspires novels, films, games, and modern pagan revivals. From Tolkien's Middle-earth to Marvel's Thor, the gods of the Vikings still stride across our culture, art, and craftsmanship. The Vikings were more than warriors. They were master craftsmen. Their art blended simplicity with elegance, strength with beauty. Wood carvings adorned longships, and houses with twisting patterns of animals and interlacing lines. Jewelry of silver and bronze carried designs that still fascinate modern eyes. Weapons, though tools of war, were also objects of art. Swords etched with patterns, hilts decorated with intricate designs. Shipbuilding itself was an art. A longship was not just a vessel, but a masterpiece of engineering and beauty. Its curved prow, often carved with dragons or serpents, gave it a sense of both grace and terror. Through these crafts, the Vikings expressed their worldview, dynamic, fluid, filled with movement and interwoven forces. Law and memory. Culture is not only stories and art, it is also law and custom. The Vikings prized justice and order, even amid their fierce independence. The Thing, their assembly, was where free men gathered to make decisions, settle disputes, and shape society. Laws were not written at first. They were recited by the law speaker, who memorized them and proclaimed them before the people. This oral legal tradition was as important as the sagas. It kept society functioning in a world without centralized power. Later, as kingdoms formed, these assemblies influenced the development of parliaments and democratic ideas. In Iceland, the Althing, founded around 930, still exists today, making it one of the oldest parliaments in the world. The Scandinavian identity. As centuries passed, and as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became Christian kingdoms, the memory of the Viking Age lingered. It became part of their identity. In medieval times, sagas and stories kept the old heroes alive. In the 19th century, during the age of nationalism, people looked back to the Vikings as symbols of strength and independence. Today, Scandinavian countries celebrate their Viking heritage in festivals, museums, and scholarship. Yet, the identity is not just about glory. It is also about complexity. The Vikings were raiders and traders, destroyers and builders, pagans and Christians. Their legacy is both fearsome and fascinating. Global memory. The Viking Age left marks not only in Scandinavia, but across the world. Place names in England, Ireland, and Scotland still echo Norse origins. York from Jorvik, Dublin from Dyflin. Words in English, like sky, egg, knife, and window, come from Old Norse. In Russia, the legacy of the Rus, Norsemen who founded states along the rivers, endures in the very name of the country. In Normandy, descendants of Vikings became French lords and later conquerors of England. Even in the Middle East, travelers remembered tall, fair-haired warriors serving in Constantinople as the Varangian Guard. The Vikings became part of the memory of many lands, woven into their languages, cultures, and histories, the eternal echo of the North. What, then, is the cultural legacy of the Viking Age? It is the echo of voices across time, the sagas that still move us, the runes that still puzzle and inspire, the gods who still live in modern stories, the art that still enchants with its flowing lines. It is also the legacy of resilience, the ability of a people to transform from raiders to kings, from pagans to Christians, from outsiders to Europeans, without losing the spirit that made them unique. When we read the sagas, when we see a rune stone, when we watch the northern lights dance across the sky, we hear the whisper of the North, a whisper that says, "We were here, we lived, we dreamed, and our memory will not fade." The Last Roar, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. In the year 1066, a mighty host gathered under the banner of Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. Tall, fierce, and seasoned by decades of war, Harald was no mere king. He was a legend, a warrior who had fought across continents, served as a commander in the Byzantine Empire, and dreamed of adding England to his crown. When his longships sailed into English waters, it felt as if the old Viking spirit had returned one final time. The dragon-headed prows glided up the Humber River. Warriors marched proudly, their mail gleaming, their banners snapping in the wind. This was no small raid, this was conquest. At first, victory smiled on Harold. At Fulford, his men defeated the English earls. The path to York seemed open. For a moment, it seemed that England would once again fall under the shadow of Norse power. But fate had other plans. King Harold Godwinson of England marched his army north with astonishing speed. On the 25th of September, the English king met the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. The battle that followed was fierce, brutal, and unforgettable. Legend tells of a lone Viking holding the bridge against the English army, cutting down foe after foe until he was slain from below. It was a story that embodied the courage and defiance of the Norse spirit. But even such bravery could not turn the tide. Harald Hardrada was struck down by an arrow through the throat. His army was shattered.